The courtroom hums with quiet anticipation. Judge Holloway, a seasoned, smug man, leans back in his chair, already amused by the black woman before him. He chuckles, assuming this case is like any other. Another defendant pleading for leniency. But when Danielle Carter reaches into her blazer and reveals a golden badge, the air in the room shifts. U.S. Secret Service. Holloway's smirk vanishes, replaced by sheer panic. The power has shifted, and today, justice will not be blind. It will be reckoning. The courtroom was packed, the air thick with the weight of expectation. Rows of people sat in tense silence, waiting for the next case to begin. Dim overhead lights buzzed softly, casting a dull glow over the polished wooden benches. At the front of the room, Judge Richard Holloway sat high on his bench, tapping his fingers impatiently on the desk before him. He was an older man, well into his 60s, with silver hair and deep lines carved into his face from years of scowling at defendants. To him, this was just another routine case. Another face. Another name. Another person wasting his time. His expression was one of thinly veiled annoyance, his lips curling slightly as he glanced at the file in front of him. He hadn't even heard the defendant speak yet, but he had already decided this case would be an easy one. A small smirk played at the corner of his mouth as he finally looked up from the papers and locked eyes with the woman sitting at the defense table. Danielle Carter sat straight-backed, composed, her expression unreadable. She was dressed professionally in a crisp navy blue suit, her black hair pulled back into a neat bun. Every part of her demeanor radiated control, but Judge Holloway did not bother to notice. His smirk widened. He let out a small chuckle, shaking his head as he scanned the courtroom. "Well, well," he mused loudly, making sure his voice carried so the jury and spectators could hear. "Another entitled individual who thinks the law doesn't apply to them." A ripple of laughter passed through a few members of the courtroom. The prosecutor, a younger man in his 30s, pressed his lips together, staying silent. The jurors, however, shifted uncomfortably. Danielle did not flinch. She did not react at all. Her hands remained folded neatly in her lap, her expression calm. Judge Holloway leaned forward, now fully amused. "I assume you're here to claim you were wrongfully arrested? That this is all just a big misunderstanding?" More quiet chuckles echoed through the room. Danielle's lips barely moved, but for the briefest second, a slight smile flickered at the corner of her mouth. It wasn't nervous. It wasn't uncertain. It was the kind of smile that sent a warning before the storm. The prosecutor cleared his throat, shifting slightly in his seat. "Your Honor, the defendant, Miss Carter?" Judge Holloway waved a hand dismissively, cutting him off. "Let's not waste the court's time." He turned back to Danielle, raising an eyebrow. "Why don't you tell me why you think you're special?" The laughter from the gallery was louder this time. But Danielle did not react. She exhaled slowly, tilting her head slightly as if she were studying the judge. She didn't rush. She didn't stutter. She simply waited for the perfect moment to respond. And when she did, her voice was steady, even, and precise. "With all due respect, Your Honor, I'd prefer to stick to facts rather than opinions." For the briefest second, Judge Holloway's smirk faltered. It was subtle, so small that most people in the room missed it. But Danielle saw it. She saw the way his fingers stopped drumming on the bench, the way his lips pressed together just slightly before curling back into another smirk. The judge scoffed. "Facts?" he echoed, tilting his head. "All right, Miss Carter, let's hear your facts." Danielle did not blink. And in that moment, the power in the room began to shift. She wasn't here to beg. She wasn't here to argue. She was here to end this. And the judge had no idea what was coming next. Judge Holloway's smirk widened as he leaned forward, his fingers tapping impatiently against the polished wood of his bench. He could already feel the weight of the courtroom's silence, the power he held over it. The defendant before him, just another black woman, just another name in his long career, was nothing more than an afterthought. The judge's voice, thick with sarcasm, cut through the stillness like a blade. "Let us not waste time," he mused, making sure his words carried enough weight to fill every corner of the room. "Why do you think you are special?" A few quiet chuckles rippled through the courtroom, emboldened by the judge's mockery. Some jurors shifted awkwardly in their seats, others exchanged glances, sensing the sharp edge in the air. Danielle Carter, however, remained unmoved. She sat perfectly still, her back straight, her hands resting lightly on the table before her. Her dark eyes studied Holloway with an unsettling calmness, a sharp contrast to the smirking judge before her. The silence stretched longer than he expected. Then, she finally spoke. "With all due respect, Your Honor," she said, her voice smooth, measured, and unwavering. "Let us stick to facts, not opinions." A murmur swept through the crowd. One of the jurors raised an eyebrow. A court reporter hesitated mid-typing. Even the prosecutor flicked his gaze toward Danielle, a brief flicker of curiosity in his eyes, because no one spoke to Judge Holloway like that. The judge's smirk faltered. For the briefest second, his amusement thinned, his fingers pausing against the wood. It was almost imperceptible, the way his jaw tightened ever so slightly, the way his nostrils flared as he inhaled. But Danielle saw it. She knew this kind of man. She had dealt with men like Holloway before, men who sat high above others, convinced of their own power, mistaking cruelty for authority. But today, he had chosen the wrong person. Holloway scoffed, shaking his head, trying to regain his footing. "Facts, he echoed mockingly, sitting back in his chair. "All right, Miss Carter, let us hear your facts." The murmurs in the courtroom did not fade. Some of the spectators were no longer just watching. They were observing. Something in the air had shifted. They saw the way the judge had hesitated, the way his usual confidence wavered for a fraction of a second before he covered it with more smugness. The prosecutor cleared his throat awkwardly, glancing at his notes as if searching for an escape from the tension unraveling before him. Danielle, however, was in no hurry. She inhaled slowly, deliberately, as if savoring the moment. Then, without breaking eye contact with Holloway, she reached into her blazer pocket. The movement was calm, practiced, but to the bailiff at the side of the room, it was enough to make him stiffen instinctively. The judge opened his mouth to speak, ready to make another condescending remark, but then she pulled out a small black leather case and flipped it open. A hush fell over the courtroom. The prosecutor's pen slipped from his fingers and clattered onto the desk. A few jurors leaned forward, their eyes widening in disbelief. Judge Holloway's face drained of color. The unmistakable glint of gold gleamed under the dim courtroom lights. Inside the case, bold engraved letters stood out against the polished metal. Danielle Carter, United States Secret Service. The silence that followed was deafening. For the first time that day, Judge Holloway had no words. The room seemed to shrink. Danielle Carter's hand moved with precise control, reaching into the inner pocket of her blazer. The bailiff, standing stiffly near the judge's bench, reacted instantly, his body tensing, his eyes flicking toward her hand. Years of working in courtrooms had trained him to recognize threats, to anticipate sudden movements. His fingers twitched near his belt, a subconscious response to the unknown. Judge Holloway noticed the reaction, and a familiar smirk played at the edges of his lips. He was already preparing his next scolding. Another dramatic speech about respecting the authority of the court, about reckless behavior, about people who thought they were above the law. He was ready to put her in her place. But then, he saw it. The golden badge. For a split second, he did not register what he was looking at. His smirk remained, his mind still trying to form the words of his rebuke. Then his gaze focused, the polished metal reflecting under the dim courtroom lights. The words engraved into the surface hit him like a freight train. United States Secret Service. The prosecutor's pen slipped from his fingers and clattered against the wooden desk. A few jurors leaned forward, their eyes widening, their postures shifting as they strained to get a better look. A hushed murmur rippled through the gallery, but no one dared speak too loudly, as if raising their voices would shatter the reality of what they had just witnessed. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. For the first time in years, Judge Holloway's face showed something other than smug amusement or hardened indifference. It showed fear. Danielle did not move. She let the badge sit in the open, resting on the table like an unshakable truth. She did not need to explain what it meant. Everyone in that room already understood. The judge's fingers tightened around the armrests of his chair. His pulse thundered in his ears. His breath, once steady and controlled, hitched. Danielle Carter was not just another defendant. She was the government. Holloway's lips parted slightly, but no sound came out. The authority he had wielded so effortlessly just moments ago had crumbled beneath him, slipping through his fingers like sand. Danielle exhaled slowly, deliberately. Then, in the same calm and precise manner, she set the badge down on the table. It was not a dramatic gesture. It was a statement. Her fingers slid away from the leather case, leaving it in full view for everyone to see. The prosecutor swallowed hard, his eyes darting between the badge and the judge. His entire case had just fallen apart. Danielle's voice was smooth when she finally spoke. "My name," she said, clear and unshaken, "is Special Agent Danielle Carter, United States Secret Service." The silence deepened. The courtroom no longer belonged to Holloway. It belonged to her. The judge swallowed thickly, his Adam's apple bobbing. He clenched his jaw, struggling to maintain some sense of control, but it was useless. The shift in power was absolute. Danielle let the moment sink in before continuing. "And before we proceed any further," she said, her voice as measured as before, "I think it is important to acknowledge that my arrest was not only unjustified, but also a direct violation of federal law." A cold wave swept through the courtroom. The weight of her words crushed the air itself. Judge Holloway sat frozen, trapped. Danielle reached into her bag again, this time producing a sealed government document. "This," she said, sliding the folder toward the bailiff, "is an official complaint drafted by the Department of Justice. It details the numerous violations committed by the officers who arrested me." Her eyes flicked back to Holloway, including the falsified report that made its way into this courtroom. Holloway's hands, once so confident and steady, were gripping the edge of his desk so tightly his knuckles turned white. The judge, once arrogant and untouchable, was now sitting in his own courtroom, in his own seat of power, and realizing he was utterly, completely outmatched. The weight of the moment settled over the courtroom like an unbreakable force. Danielle Carter sat still, composed, and completely in control. The golden badge gleamed under the dim lights, a silent declaration of power. The air was thick, dense with realization. Judge Holloway, once so smug, now gripped the edge of his desk, his knuckles bone white. Danielle's voice, calm yet cutting, pierced the silence. "My arrest was not only unjustified." She let the words hang, letting everyone feel the impact before delivering the final blow. "It was a direct violation of federal law." The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably. His tie suddenly felt too tight. His breathing was shallow, as if the oxygen in the room had thinned. A few jurors leaned forward, their expressions ranging from shock to barely concealed horror. They had all witnessed Holloway's arrogance, his mocking laughter, the way he had dismissed Danielle before even hearing her case. Now, they watched him crumble. Danielle reached into her bag again, her movements slow and deliberate. She pulled out a folder, thick, sealed with the Department of Justice insignia. She placed it gently on the table, right beside the badge that had already shattered Holloway's authority. Her next words sliced through the silence like a blade. "This is an official complaint filed by the Department of Justice." Holloway's jaw tightened. Danielle slid the folder across the table toward the bailiff. The man hesitated for only a second before picking it up, his fingers trembling slightly as he scanned the contents. Danielle continued, her voice as sharp as ever. "This document details the violations committed by the officers who arrested me." She turned her gaze back to Holloway, her eyes locked onto his, unblinking, including the falsified report that made its way into this courtroom. The judge barely moved. He could not move. His face was pale, his once superior smirk now erased, replaced with something foreign on his features. Fear. His hands clenched into fists on the desk, but the grip was weak. The power had shifted, and he knew it. The prosecutor, flipping through his own documents, looked horrified. He realized he had been backing the wrong side. Danielle leaned forward slightly, her presence unwavering. "You see, Your Honor," she continued, each word perfectly measured. "The officers who arrested me never bothered to check my credentials." The murmur in the courtroom grew louder. A few gasps echoed from the gallery. Danielle exhaled slowly, placing her hands on the table in front of her, completely at ease. "Instead," she continued, "they assumed that because of the color of my skin, I must have been doing something wrong." Holloway flinched. The words hit harder than he expected. The weight of every past wrongful ruling, every mocked defendant, every biased judgment, all of it crashed down on him. His entire career was flashing before his eyes. The gasps turned to whispers. Jurors exchanged uneasy glances, fully aware that they had almost played a role in a disastrous injustice. Holloway's grip on his desk tightened, but there was no power left in his hands. His career, his entire legacy, was falling apart before his very eyes, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The silence in the courtroom was deafening. Danielle Carter sat poised, her voice unwavering, her presence commanding. "They saw my skin, not my credentials." The words landed like a thunderclap. The prosecutor, already rattled, fumbled through his papers, flipping pages frantically as though searching for some loophole, some overlooked detail that could salvage the case. There was nothing. His face turned pale as realization dawned. They had made a colossal mistake. A mistake that was now on full display. Judge Holloway, once the most confident man in the room, now looked as if the very weight of his own arrogance was suffocating him. His hands trembled, though he tried to hide it, his fingers still gripping the edges of his desk, like a man holding onto the last shreds of his dignity. Danielle took a breath, her voice calm yet cutting. "This is about power being abused without question." Holloway swallowed, but the lump in his throat would not go away. A single bead of sweat rolled down his temple. Danielle kept her gaze locked on him. "But today, Judge Holloway," she said, her tone razor-sharp, "you questioned the wrong person." The weight of her words seemed to age him instantly. The once smug, all-powerful judge now looked like a shadow of himself, his face drawn, his confidence shattered. The jury sat motionless. Some looked at Holloway. Others could not bring themselves to meet his gaze. The gallery, once filled with whispers and murmurs, was now so quiet that the faint buzzing of the overhead lights filled the room like an eerie soundtrack to his downfall. The prosecutor, for the first time, spoke, though his voice lacked its former confidence. "Your Honor," he started, his throat dry. Holloway blinked, barely processing the words. The prosecutor cleared his throat, forcing himself to regain composure as he turned to the judge. "In light of this new information," he said, carefully choosing his words, "the prosecution requests that all charges against Miss Carter be immediately dropped." The courtroom erupted into hushed gasps. Jurors exchanged glances, some of them barely masking their disgust at what had almost happened. Danielle sat still. She had expected nothing less. Judge Holloway, still gripping his desk, tried to salvage what little he had left. His lips parted. He wanted to protest. He wanted to say something, anything to justify how he had treated her, but there was nothing left to say. With a voice that barely carried any authority, he muttered, "Case dismissed." The gavel slammed down, but for the first time in Judge Holloway's long career, it was not his authority that silenced the room. It was Danielle Carter. She gathered her things calmly, showing no sign of triumph, no arrogance, only quiet certainty. And then, as she stepped toward the exit, she paused. She turned her head just slightly, looking back at the judge one last time. Her words were clear, deliberate, and final. "Next time," she said, her voice cutting through the silence, "think before you laugh." And with that, she walked out, leaving Judge Richard Holloway sitting there, pale, humiliated, and knowing that his career, his reputation, his entire legacy was over. Because after today, the world would hear about this. The prosecutor shot to his feet, his chair screeching loudly against the polished floor. His face was pale, his hands trembling as he tried to compose himself. "Your Honor," he began, his voice cracking slightly. The weight of his mistake pressed down on him, heavier than the silent stares of the jurors, heavier than the knowledge that his career might never recover from this. "All charges against Miss Carter must be dropped immediately." The words rang out, final and absolute. Judge Holloway barely reacted at first. His hands gripped the edges of his desk, knuckles turning white. He had been waiting for this moment, this exact moment, but not like this. Not as the loser, not as the man who underestimated the wrong person. His mouth opened, but no words came out. He swallowed, staring blankly at Danielle Carter, who sat across the courtroom, unmoved. She was waiting. She already knew how this would end, and she was in no rush. The silence stretched, an unbearable weight pressing against Holloway's chest. His eyes darted to the prosecutor, to the jury, to the gallery full of people who were watching his downfall. No sympathy, no support, no one would speak for him now. Judge Holloway, the same man who had just been laughing, the same man who mocked her before hearing a single fact, now looked small, weak. His legacy was cracking in real time, and the entire room could feel it. His hands trembled as he reached for the gavel, gripping it like a man holding onto the last piece of control he had left. His throat was dry, the words coming out barely above a whisper. "Case dismissed." The gavel slammed down with finality, and the silence that followed wasn't one of power. It was humiliation. Holloway stared at the desk, avoiding eye contact, as though refusing to acknowledge his defeat. Danielle exhaled slowly. She didn't smirk. She didn't gloat. Instead, she did exactly what she had planned to do from the start. She stood, adjusting her blazer with the same precise, unshaken composure she had held through the entire trial. Her presence commanded the room without a single extra word. She picked up her badge, securing it back into her blazer pocket. Her movements were slow, deliberate. And then, she turned. Without a single glance at Judge Holloway, without a final word, without any acknowledgement of the man who had just tried to ruin her life, she walked. Each step echoed in the silent courtroom, heels clicking against the hard floor, marking the rhythm of her victory. She reached the doors and paused for just a second, letting the tension sit, letting the judge feel every ounce of the weight he had brought onto himself. Then, she pushed open the doors and left. Judge Holloway sat frozen, his breath shallow, staring down at his desk as if he had just watched his own career end in real time. Because he had. The courtroom remained silent long after she was gone. No one spoke. No one dared to break the tension lingering in the air like a ghost. And Holloway? He did not look up. He could feel their stares, the prosecutor, the jury, the entire gallery. His arrogance was gone. The power he abused was now nothing more than a memory. And today, the system that always protected him had just abandoned him. Danielle Carter reached the door, her heels clicking with deliberate precision, each step marking the rhythm of her victory. The air in the courtroom was thick, suffocating under the weight of what had just happened. Judge Holloway still hadn't moved. His hands gripped the edge of his bench, his shoulders rigid, as if physically bracing against reality. Danielle paused. For the first time since the trial began, she turned. Her gaze swept the room, calm, controlled, powerful. And then, her voice cut through the silence. "Next time, think before you laugh." The words hung in the air like a slow-moving storm. Judge Holloway's throat bobbed, his face a sickly shade of white. His arrogance was gone. His power was gone. His career? Hanging by a thread. He didn't speak. He couldn't. Not when every single person in the room had just watched his downfall. The jury sat frozen, their gazes bouncing between Danielle and Holloway. The prosecutor, who had once smirked at her, now looked like he wanted to disappear into his chair. And the gallery? They were buzzing. A low, growing murmur of disbelief and realization. They had never seen a judge silenced like this. Not like this. Danielle Carter, the woman he had laughed at, mocked, dismissed before hearing a single fact, had just destroyed him. Not with anger, not with threats, but with truth, with power, with the simple, unavoidable weight of who she was. Judge Holloway swallowed hard, his Adam's apple visibly shifting. He tried to compose himself, to straighten his shoulders, to regain even an ounce of the authority he once had. But he couldn't, because for the first time in his career, he was the one being judged. Danielle let the silence suffocate him for just a moment longer. And then, she turned back around. With no hesitation, no doubt, she pushed open the doors, and as they swung shut behind her, Judge Holloway finally exhaled, a slow, shaky breath, like a man who had just barely survived a disaster. The gavel was still in his hand, but it felt useless now. What was once his symbol of power was now nothing more than a prop in his own humiliation. And the courtroom, the room where he had once ruled without question, now felt like a cage. The murmurs grew louder, people whispered, some even chuckled, mocking him in the same way he had mocked her. And he knew. He knew that this moment would follow him forever. The viral headlines, the murmurs in hallways, the conversations behind his back. It was over. Everything he had built, everything he had used to belittle others, everything he had relied on for power. Gone. All because he had underestimated the wrong woman. And for the first time in his entire career, Judge Richard Holloway felt powerless. The moment Danielle Carter walked out of that courtroom, the world changed for Judge Holloway. At first, it was just whispers, a few murmurs from the lawyers, a quiet conversation between jurors, a stunned exchange between the courtroom staff. Then, the whispers grew louder. A journalist in the back scribbled furiously in his notebook. Another reporter sent a text, short, direct, the kind that would ignite a storm. Judge Holloway just got exposed in court. We need to cover this, now. By the time Holloway staggered to his chambers, his hands still shaking from gripping his desk too hard, the courthouse was buzzing. Everywhere he turned, eyes were on him. Not with the fear or respect he was used to. No. This was different. This was the look of people who had just witnessed a fall from power. The security guard at the front desk avoided his gaze. A court clerk, who normally greeted him with, "Good morning, Your Honor," quickly looked away. Judge Holloway felt it. The shift, the loss of control, the very thing he had spent years building, his authority, his reputation, his ability to silence a courtroom with a single look. Gone. And it was only getting worse. Because now, the news had spread. Fast. By the end of the day, headlines were already popping up. Judge Holloway mocked a black woman in court. Then she destroyed him. Secret Service agent destroys smug judge in viral courtroom showdown. Justice hits back, hard. Holloway gripped the edges of his desk, staring at his phone as the notifications piled up. The legal community was talking. Lawyers were sharing clips, dissecting his expression, breaking down every second of his downfall. "Did you see his face when she pulled out that badge?" one post read. "Man thought he was about to ruin her life. Turns out she ruined his," another tweet said. And then, the worst part. The calls started coming in. His office phone rang. His personal phone buzzed. Emails flooded his inbox. His reputation was crumbling, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The Judicial Review Board, the very people who oversaw misconduct cases for judges, wanted a meeting. Immediately. His peers, the same ones who once shook his hand and called him the most commanding judge in the district, were now distancing themselves. By the next morning, his name was everywhere. On the news, on radio shows, on social media. People weren't just talking about what happened. They were demanding consequences. This is what happens when power goes unchecked. Judges like him have ruined lives for years. Time to hold them accountable. And Holloway? He knew. There was no coming back from this. This wasn't just embarrassment. This wasn't just a bad moment in court. This was the end of everything. Meanwhile, Danielle Carter had already moved on. She had no interest in interviews, no desire for headlines or attention. She had done what she came to do, and that was enough. As she walked down the courthouse steps, she took one last deep breath. Because this wasn't just her victory. This wasn't just about her name. This was about something bigger. About a system that thought it could laugh at her. And now that system had fallen silent. Justice was served. But this was only the beginning.